So let's go ahead and pause briefly for the notes for today. Let's go ahead and open up your notes file. All right, so we had previously talked about the 1950s society and how it evolved over time. That's what the bell ringer was about. And then, of course, the president during the 50s was Eisenhower. So hopefully we were able to work on that activity, maybe get it completed. You just had to read through one of those websites about his presidency and type 10 things, significant items, and answer that question, why do you or don't you believe he was an effective leader? So today for the notes, we'll look at foreign affairs in particular, because the United States after World War II will be a lot more involved in what goes on around the globe. After World War I, we kind of went back to isolationism, but that would change after World War II. So, foreign affairs of the 1950s. And of course, the biggest foreign policy that we concentrated on was containment. Containment, containment, containment. Stop communism from growing. We were obsessed with it. So, just about everything that we did to some extent involved containment. For instance, we had decided that we were going to encourage the world to decolonize. So, Britain, France, all those other countries, we were going to convince them to give up their colonies. The exception was if it was going to help communism. If we knew a country or a territory was going to be decolonized and the communists would take over, then we wouldn't say you should decolonize. We would encourage them to keep it. Probably the best or worst example would be Vietnam. The Vietnamese, particularly in the north, were communist, and we wanted France to give up all their colonies, but because we knew Vietnam might go communist, we said, hey, maybe not in this one case. But it was actually quite a few different cases. So we wanted countries to decolonize unless it would help communism. So, and that's probably one important thing to write down because we'll talk about this. There's a whole unit on it, but it's that France was allowed to keep Vietnam, and specifically because of containment. So France was allowed to keep Vietnam. The United States also started supplying resources to stop communism. The United States also started supplying resources to stop communism. So, for instance, in Vietnam, we gave resources to the French. So we supplied resources to stop communism. And the last item underneath containment here is negotiations were opened with fascist leaders. Negotiations were opened with fascist leaders. Are fascist leaders bad people? Yes. Someone who's dead by this point was Adolf Hitler. He was a fascist leader. But there's one thing that fascist leaders aren't, and that's communist. So we started opening negotiations with fascist leaders. Like the guy up on the screen. That is Francisco Franco, who was the fascist leader of Spain. In fact, he only became leader because he got help from Adolf Hitler, but he wasn't a communist. So that's all that mattered to the United States.
Well, you're a bad guy, but you're not a communist. You're a good guy.
That's right.
You're a good bad guy. That's a good bad guy.
And then there would be parts of the world we would start to become more involved with. Asia. One of the things that we did in Asia is we recognized Taiwan as the real China. We recognized Taiwan as the real China. Remember, China had a civil war. The nationalists lost. They fled to the island of Taiwan. So we only recognized Taiwan as the real China. We ignored the communist part, even though the communist part had hundreds of millions of people. So we backed Taiwan as the real China. The communist takeover of the mainland was a humiliation for us. The communist takeover of the mainland was a humiliation for us. We had sent supplies during World War II. We even stationed some of our Army Air Force there to help stop the Japanese from bombing China. And then shortly after the war, it ended up going communist. So it was a humiliation for the United States. Another significant thing that will happen that will continue to be important for today would be the United States recognized Israel in 1948. The United States recognized Israel in 1948. Going along with that, the Eisenhower Doctrine was established. The Eisenhower Doctrine. The Eisenhower Doctrine said that any Middle Eastern country that asked for help would get it. Any Middle Eastern country that asked for help would get it. And of course, that started with Israel. We knew Israel was surrounded by Arab Muslim countries that didn't like the fact that Israel was established. And so we sent a lot of money and weapons and other types of resources to Israel. And not everyone liked that the United States was getting involved. Fred speaking. Yeah, we started the notes though, so I'll send them down when we're done. Thank you. Bye. So India was a country that criticized U.S. actions. India criticized U.S. actions. Remember, India had gotten its independence from Britain, so they were an independent country, and they began to criticize United States actions. So just because we were offering assistance didn't necessarily mean all countries wanted it. And of course, something we already mentioned, the CIA helped overthrow the government of Iran. The CIA helped overthrow the government of Iran. That's important because we're not using our military to do this. We're using our network of spies and intelligence to take these kind of actions instead of the military. The American people after World War II and Korea didn't really want us fighting in all kinds of different countries. So this was a civilian solution to the problem. But there would be some countries that would voluntarily ask for help. For instance, in 1958, Lebanon and Jordan asked for American assistance and got it. So some countries did voluntarily ask for help. 1958, Lebanon and Jordan asked for help. (1958) Lebanon and Jordan asked for help. And then, of course, something that doesn't come up a lot in American history is the rest of America. So the last slide here is Latin America. For a long time, we followed what is called the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe Doctrine, M-O-N-R-O-E. Monroe Doctrine. That goes the whole way back to James Monroe. And what the Monroe Doctrine said is there should be no interference in the Western Hemisphere. No interference in the Western Hemisphere. Back during James Monroe's time, he was concerned about the British or the French or somebody else trying to build a big empire right next to the United States. But obviously, in this era, it's going to be concerned with communism. What's that now? There should be no empires built in America.
Put it up on the board.
The United States, though, has been very involved since the imperial era. The United States has been very involved since the imperial era. So we have been getting involved with Latin American countries before, especially when we wanted to build a canal. And of course, that would be the country of Panama. It actually didn't exist. We helped create Panama by breaking it away from its neighboring country just so we could build a canal there. So we have been involved since the imperial era. But during this time, in the 50s, for instance, in the country of Guatemala, which is spelled Guatemala, Guatemala. In the country of Guatemala, the communists there tried to take over some of that country's fruit companies, which is where we got most of our tropical fruits. So, of course, we ended up sending resources to their opponents. The communists there started to take over some of the fruit companies, so we sent resources to their opponents. That's why sometimes you might hear them called banana wars, or some of these Latin American countries are referred to as banana republics. We also helped keep the leader of the Dominican Republic in power, despite the fact that he was a brutal murderer. We also helped keep the leader of the Dominican Republic in power, even though he was a brutal murderer. He was even connected to some murders that took place in the United States. But he wasn't a communist. And we allied with one other person, Juan Perón, which is spelled Juan, second name Peron. Peron. He used the military to suppress the people of Argentina. He used the military to suppress the people of Argentina. At first, we didn't like him, but then, of course, he promised not to be a communist, and so then he was a friend. The CIA was often used to back non-communists, no matter what they were. CIA was used to back non-communists, no matter who they were. But sometimes that didn't work. It didn't always work out in our favor. For instance, in Cuba, the leader Batista, which is spelled Batista, Batista, he was overthrown by Fidel Castro, a communist. I know, so it didn't work everywhere. Batista, who's one of our guys, ended up being overthrown by the communist Fidel Castro. Not that Batista was a great person. He was also a bad person, but he was our bad person. That's right.
Was that a get out of jail free card back then?
It basically was, yes. For a limited time. I mean, obviously, if they became too out of control, there was, let me think here. Which country was that? I can't remember. The leader of one of the Latin American countries in Central America was even a CIA spy. He worked for the CIA. But he eventually got so brutal, we sent in the military and removed him from power. So we did have our limits. And then just lastly, just some bigger policies that Eisenhower had. I just want to mention 4 items here, and that's it. The first one is massive retaliation. So one of Eisenhower's policies was massive retaliation. And what did we use for massive retaliation? Nuclear weapons.
Oh, that's great. That's a great one. Maybe that's where we got the Batista one from.
The second item is brinkmanship. 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 That means the United States would never back down. Never back down. The third item would be one we already discussed, the domino theory. The domino theory. When one country falls, the rest will follow. The domino theory. So that's why we were incredibly protective of Latin America, because we thought if Argentina went, then Chile would, and then it just worked their way up through South America to Mexico, and then it would threaten the United States. So the domino theory, that one nation falling would lead to others, was incredibly prominent. And the last item that I'll mention is the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex. So Eisenhower warned that defense companies, in other words, companies that make stuff for the military, defense companies like to promote warfare. Defense companies like to promote warfare because if we're always at war or always preparing for war, they're always going to get new orders for equipment and resources and make money off of it. So when he left office, right before he left office, he gave a speech warning about the military-industrial complex. For the remainder of the period, hopefully you can get up the Eisenhower activity wrapped up if you haven't already done so, or go back and finish one of the previous assignments that maybe you didn't get finished from last week before we left for break.